Good morning. My name is Gloria, and I am an investor and a realtor for investors here in the Indianapolis area. And this morning, I'm going to go over the purchase agreement. So, what is the purchase agreement? The purchase agreement is the offer that you are making to the seller to purchase their home. This is a legal and binding contract, and a lot of times your home or your investment is one of the biggest purchases you're going to make. So, you need to make sure that you really understand what a purchase agreement is. So, First of all, a purchase agreement, the people involved in it are actually your agent. So your buyer's agent is the one that will be representing you, and the seller will also have a listing agent that will be representing them. There are a few other circumstances with that, but for the most part, this is how it works. And their names and brokerages are included in this contract. And then you and the seller are the ones that actually will be signing the contract at the bottom of the contract. So, what all is included in a real estate purchase agreement? So, first of all, it's the legal description of the house, exactly where the house is, what the actual legal description from the property taxes is, so you know exactly which house and which property you're getting, and then everything that's included with the house. So, basically, in Indiana, and I assume that this is true for other states as well, anything that is attached to the house is included with the purchase. Anything that you're not sure about, make sure that you include in the purchase agreement so that you're clear about that. So, like for instance, curtain rods, curtains, TV mounts that are attached to the wall, sheds that are outside. That's a permanent part of the property. And then other things you might want to include in there are things like the oven, the stove, the refrigerator, dishwasher, things like that. You want to make sure that you handwrite in there to make sure that they're included. Next, that is laid out in the purchase agreement is the earnest money. So the earnest money is actually the money that is binding your contract. This contract is not in full effect until that earnest money is in. So you need to make sure that it's very clear how much the earnest money is, when that earnest money needs to be in, and who is holding the earnest money. This earnest money has to be taken care of very carefully. If it's the brokerage or the title company that has the earnest money, they have to keep it completely separate in a escrow account. They cannot use that for any other money. So that money has to be kept in a separate account. If the transaction closes, then that money will go towards the transaction. If it does not, then we'll have to have a mutual release that determines who that earnest money is released to. So the earnest money is your good faith telling that seller that you really want to go through with this transaction. And if you just change your mind and decide you don't want to do the transaction, they can keep that earnest money. If the transaction falls apart because of some contingency in the transaction, then you have the right to get that earnest money back. So the earnest money is a very important part of the contract and needs to be in place to seal the contract. The next thing that is discussed in the purchase agreement is financing. Are you going to pay this with cash? Are you going to be financing it? What type of financing are you using? Are you using insured conventional financing? Are you going to use the assistance of an FHA loan or a VA loan? Are you going to use a down payment assistance? Are you going to do seller financing? There's several different ways that you can finance a property, and that's all laid out here in the purchase agreement. Along with financing and the earnest money, I want to make sure that you know about wire fraud. Wire fraud is very real. Just a little side note here, because there is so much money that is exchanged hands during a purchase of property, the bad guys out there know that, and they're in there constantly trying to find ways to get their hands on this money. So make sure if you're wiring money, you know exactly where it's going. A lot of the title companies have extra precautions in place to make sure that your money is safe. So make sure that you're very, very careful. You know exactly what the wiring instructions are and where they are, where they're going. So just want to put a little side note in there. Be very careful when you're wiring money. There are possibilities that things could happen. So you just want to be careful with that. The next part of the purchase agreement is contingencies. So there are contingencies that are put in place, kind of different stopgaps to just make sure that you are getting the property that you want, and that it is what the seller has promised. That is truly what it is going to be, that you want to make sure that you're going to purchase this property. So the first one kind of goes along with financing, and it's the appraisal. So the appraisal is ordered by the lender. You as a buyer, I as the lender himself, and I as the real estate agent are not supposed to know who the appraiser is so that it can be kept very neutral. So he is making a neutral decision to determine the value of your property. So if for some reason the property does not appraise, that is a stopgap there that you could actually get out of the contract, or it is a possibility that you could bring more money to the table above and beyond the loan to make sure that that the transaction still goes through. So the appraisal is a neutral third party that determines the value of the property for the lender, so they know how much that they can lend to you. The second contingency is inspections. So you have the right, depending how you word the contract, you can either waive the inspection, you can have the right to independent inspections, or you can do what's called an as-is addendum. So you can still get your inspection, but you're telling the seller that you're going to accept the property as is. So with inspections, basically you will hire your own independent inspector, and they will go out to the property. They'll inspect things like the foundation, the roof, the HVAC, the electrical, the plumbing, anything like that. You want to make sure that everything is good and it's the value of the property that you're paying for. So you have the right to do that inspections. After the inspections, usually that's a negotiating point that you can go back to the seller and make some negotiations there if needed, or you can just accept the property as it is. Or if the property is just in way worse shape than you thought it was, that isn't a chance for you to get out of the transaction and get your earnest money back. So the inspections is the number 2 contingency. The third contingency is title. So you want to make sure that you have good, free and clear title, that there's not an ex-wife or a third cousin or someone that lays claim to this property. You also want to make sure that there's no liens on the property. So like for property taxes, medical liens, mortgage liens, different things like that, all of that needs to be free and clear before you take over possession of the property. So a title company actually will do this search and they will actually ensure that this title is free and clear. So you'll always have that title contingency. If for some reason they can't get that title free and clear, this also is another chance where you can back out of the transaction, get your earnest money back, or do negotiations again to somehow work through those title issues. A few other things that you could put in there as contingencies to just kind of help you with the transaction is a survey. You want to make sure that the property lines where they are and that there's not encroachment of a fence or a neighbor's garage or something like that. So survey is something you can do. Another small contingency is flood zone. Check to see if it's in flood zone. Most of the time, if it is in a flood zone and you're getting a loan on the property, you're going to have to pay an extra $80 to $100 in insurance. Building limitations. What are you going to do with this property? Are you going to run a business out of it? Are you going to use it as investment property? For the most part, you need to build in there that you have a few days just to research to make sure that you can do what you want to do with the property. And then insurability. So there are certain houses that maybe had a fire before, or for whatever reason, the insurance company looks at that particular address and says, no, we're not going to insure that. So you need to make sure that you have insurability. A few extras that are included in the purchase agreement are the disclosures. So these will be addendums that will be added to the purchase agreement, but you need to note in the purchase agreement if you've received them or not. First of all is the seller's disclosure. So the seller, if the seller knows of any major defect or anything wrong with the property, for instance, if he knows that he had mold in the past and he treated it, or if it had asbestos or something that was, a defect of the property, the roof is leaking, he has to disclose that to you. And so that's put in the form of a seller's disclosure, which is an addendum to the purchase agreement. The other one is lead-based paint. This is something that any house that was built before 1978 has to have the lead-based paint disclosure. And if they know that there was lead-based paint in the property, then they do have to disclose that to you. Most properties before 1978 do have that lead-based paint in there at some point. But since then, the paints are mostly latex, and it probably has been painted over since then. Lead-based paint, and again, this is another whole podcast, but Lead-based paint is dangerous when it is flaking and ingested. So I would suggest to always put in there that you're going to check for lead-based paint, have your inspector look for that, and then you can do remediation at that point. But that's an extra form that is required that we put on all purchase agreements. Extra things, other extra things that would be on there is taxes. How are property taxes handled in your state? Who is going to pay them at closing to make sure they're current? Any special assessments? For the most part, like an example of an assessment would be if the city is running sewer down your street and all the neighbors are required to hook up to it. And what they did was the city might have put a special assessment on this property that a certain amount of money has to be paid over the next 5 years. That's what a special assessment would be. Typically, title finds these when they're running their searches. So if there's anything that pops up, that's something else that needs to be disclosed. HOA docs. So basically, you need to find out with the subdivision what the rules are and if you want to agree to those rules. And if for some reason you don't, you can get out of the transaction. So I would say, especially to those of you that are investors, check those HOA documents just to make sure that you could use it as a rental property. That's a big thing. Some subdivisions only allow 10%, or they only have a certain number of properties that will allow to be rentals, and they cap that. So you need to make sure to check those out with the HOA documents. Put that in your purchase agreement to make sure you have the chance to do that. So those are a few of the extras that are on a purchase agreement. The last thing is closing, what your closing date is going to be, when possession is going to be, what condition the property will be in at that point. The seller needs to keep that property in the same condition as when you first saw it, when you wrote the purchase agreement, all the way up until closing. Make sure utilities are on or whatever you agree to. So you just need to make sure that that possession is clear of when you actually will get the property. Will you get that at closing? Will you give them a few days to move out? If there is a tenant in there, how is that being handled? Who is responsible for either taking care of the tenant, evicting the tenant, whatever needs there. So you need to make sure possession. And then costs, closing costs. Who's going to pay for what closing cost, what the different closing costs are. So for instance, for title and searches, for title insurance, for taxes, for different things like that. So you need to put very clearly in there what the closing costs are and who will be paying for them. So basically, just to kind of recap, all of the things included in a purchase agreement are the legal description, your earnest money, your financing, what contingencies are and how they'll be handled. A few little extra things just to make sure everything is clear and everyone is on the same page, and then how you're going to handle closing. So the purchase agreement basically is a very simple document that your buyer's agent should be able to guide you through every single step of the way, make sure that you understand everything. And that is something that I and my team really take pride in, is making sure that you understand everything that's going on and guiding you through every step of the process. So again, my name is Gloria. I'm an investor and a real estate agent for investors here in the Indianapolis, and we would love to write a purchase agreement for you. So if you're thinking about investing or purchasing in Indianapolis, give us a call.